With me now, Charles Coleman Jr., civil rights attorney and former New York prosecutor, James Gagliano, retired FBI chief of staff and supervisory special agent, and attorney Ariva Martin, CNN legal analyst and legal affairs commentator. So, Ariva, let me just begin with you on this note about the state. Would it be appropriate for the state to open up an investigation and potentially file charges there? How likely would that be?
Oh, absolutely appropriate and very likely that will occur. We have to keep in mind there are two different standards here. There's the federal standard where the feds are only looking at whether there was willful taking of Mr. Sterling's life, whether his civil rights were violated in that altercation that he had with those two police officers. That's not what the state attorney general will be looking at. He can look at reckless conduct. He can look at whether these officers escalated a situation that could have been de-escalated. He can look at the statement that we're hearing that one officer walked up to Mr. Sterling, put a gun to his head and said, "Bitch, I will kill you." All of that evidence can be taken into consideration by the state's attorney general. And I suspect that when you look at the totality of what the feds found, there will be state charges filed against at least one of these officers based on the press conference held by the family's attorneys.
What about, James, the way in which the DOJ handled this? You know, as Nick had pointed out, the Washington Post report, I cannot imagine being the family and hearing about this through a piece in a newspaper. What do you make of how the DOJ handled it?
Listen, it is unfortunate, Brooke. There's no way to remove the human component to this. Anybody, law enforcement or otherwise, that watches the video of the family in front of a microphone explaining, you know, how they feel about this.
You ache for them.
You do. But you also have to understand that the police officers involved in this, and I don't know them personally, but they're also entitled to due process. And police unions are collectively bargaining units. Those officers have a right until formal charges are brought. What's interesting in this case is, and I think Charles could speak to this, normally it's the state taking a look at something, a grand jury being convened and deciding not to move forward.
And then the feds step in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In this instance, the feds, and as your other contributor just pointed out, the feds have a much higher bar to reach, that standard. You have to prove mens rea. You have to prove what that person, that cop, is thinking during that struggle.
Well, Brooke, I think that raises an interesting point overall when you start talking about this particular administration and the Department of Justice and how they're going to approach these cases. Typically, as James already said, we've seen state grand juries decide whether they're going to indict these officers for these offenses. In this case, which was begun under the administration of President Obama, the feds had stepped in and they had begun looking at this. Now, within the past week, we've seen 3 different civil rights cases with respect to police and their conduct involving Black lives, whether that's Michael Slager in South Carolina, whether that's Jordan Edwards in Texas, and now we have Alton Sterling in Louisiana. And so in terms of ever since the story was broken by Wesley Lowery at the Washington Post, we've had an issue in terms of looking at how is this administration, how is this Department of Justice going to deal with these cases with respect to law enforcement and excessive use of force.
So how do you feel about it moving forward? Because you use those names, but you also have names like Tamir Rice and Eric Garner, and this is the first decision of its kind under the current AG. In fact, let me just quote Sessions saying the DOJ would, quote, hold accountable any law enforcement officer who violates the civil rights of our citizens by using excessive force. But the bar...
Well, Sessions has said a lot of things, and
it's important to just point out
absolutely
his side.
No, and I get it. Sessions has said a lot of things, and I think that at the end of the day, actions speak louder than words. This is an administration that has been very, very pro law enforcement from the beginning, and we have, and when I say we, I mean communities of color have been having an uphill battle with respect to getting justice, getting indictments, or even having due process take its form with respect to law enforcement and how they interact with communities of color. And so with respect to the verbiage and the rhetoric that we've heard, not just from Jeff Sessions, but also from the White House regarding their position on police brutality and on civil rights cases involving law enforcement, it doesn't look good.
What about the police officers, Ariva? I mean, the family wants them fired. You just heard from the family there. You know, what's the likelihood of that?
Well, Brooke, again, based on what the family's attorneys shared, and they were somewhat restrained in their comments because they do want the state investigation to go forward and not be impeded by any comments that were made And the prosecutor for the Justice Department was also restrained in his remarks because they don't want this they don't want the investigation in any way to be undermined. But from what I heard, listening to that press conference, there appeared to be some pretty compelling evidence presented by the federal prosecutors to the families. Apparently, there are 6 videotapes, and these videotapes show a 71-second incident. And from start to finish, from when the cops first approached Mr. Sterling until he shot, 71 seconds elapsed. And again, the attorneys say those 71 seconds will show enough evidence for the state's attorney to file charges against at least one of those officers who they said conduct was, they used the word heinous.
Okay.
It's critically important to remember that these are 2 different set of charges that we're going to be talking about with respect to the federal investigation and what hopefully will take place at the state level.
I got it. Quickly.
And Brooke, if I can just say, I understand that the Attorney General is a political appointee, but if anybody thinks, I'm not saying that's what Charles is saying, that the career prosecutors that make determinations as to whether or not you're going to go forward with charges in a case or not are politically affected, I would strongly throw a flag on that one.
Okay. James and Charles and Ariva, thank you all so very much on that story out of Baton Rouge.